And welcome back to Sirius XM. We'll be taking your calls at 866 997 4748, 866 997 GRIT. Graham Nash returns to our show next week. We're very excited to have Graham back. And of course, if you've missed our recent interviews with Eugene Levy or Guillermo del Toro, or this week's with Bo-Katan from The Mandalorian, you can hear all of those on the app or Sirius XM on demand. Okay, last month, you might remember it ended. It didn't get as much coverage as it needed to in this country, but last month ended with a boat that was shipwrecked off Italy. And at least 70 men, women, and children from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, and other nations died, and many others are still missing. Closer to home, thousands of Afghan refugees who got to the U.S. last year are now terrified that they may lose their work permits and might face deportation back to Afghanistan because their 2-year visas are expiring this August, unless our government takes swift action. And on top of all of this, while we're dealing with a refugee crisis around the world, we happen to have a skilled worker shortage here in the U.S. There's 80 million baby boomers that are going to be retiring, and only about 40 million Generation Xers to take their place. As of last year, we have to admit more than 1 million immigrants per year just to maintain the size of our population. Upwardly Global is the premier national organization working to help immigrants and refugees with international credentials to help restart their careers here in the United States. Their work is so incredibly inspiring and moral and economically and politically very, very smart. Jina Krause-Vilmar is president and CEO of Upwardly Global. She's an expert on refugee and immigrant economic inclusion. Under her leadership, Upwardly Global has expanded their impact by helping a growing number of immigrant and refugee professionals restart their whole careers here in the U.S., and they've recently expanded their operations to Warsaw, Poland. It's a great pleasure to welcome Jina Krause-Vilmar to Sirius XM.
Thank you, John. I'm so thrilled to be here having this conversation with you.
Well, thank you. I began talking about people who died in the boat in Italy. Many of the Afghans who died that day were women and children. I guess let me just begin by asking, how bad has the situation become under the Taliban?
The situation under the Taliban is pretty intolerable. And what's most scary about this is we're not actually getting much news coming out of Afghanistan. So you can only imagine what the reality looks like on the ground. We know that more and more restrictions come out every week on women and girls, whether it's first eliminating their ability to go to school past seventh grade, or whether it's eliminating their ability to be in public spaces without a male escort. And so it's really troubling. And it's a lot of people are still trying to get family out. A lot of people are very worried about family that are there. And we still have evacuations happening.
I have to say, I was kind of shocked to see that they're trying to escape the country on boats now. When we think about people fleeing the Taliban, we think of them crossing desert borders. But I mean, it's gotten really dire. People are just trying to get out of the country any way they can.
You know, people will pay smugglers. And the challenge here is oftentimes they don't have cash to pay smugglers. So it's really indentured servitude in a lot of ways. And
Yeah.
they're paying smugglers, and smugglers will take them in all kinds of routes. I've met Afghans who have been ended up in Ecuador, who have been smuggled there as well. And the real challenge is we know that less than 1% of refugees worldwide are resettled. So that means richer countries are not sharing their portion of the burden, while oftentimes also conflict-ridden developing countries that neighbor these countries are taking on a large portion of the burden. So you cannot blame people for looking not only for a way to be safe, but also for a way to survive.
Yes. That figure is unbelievable that only 1% of refugees have been resettled. It's kind of hard to wrap my head around that, considering with climate change, we should be expecting refugee crises to be much more widespread and devastating in the next couple of decades.
You know, at Davos, we recently heard that um, one of the largest concerns internationally is migration and how are countries setting themselves up to be better equipped to support migration. And at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, not only in the United States, but in many other industrial countries, they have aging populations, they have huge workforce shortages. And these workforce shortages are not just going to last a year or two, they are really going to be the future of these communities in these countries where they have aging populations. And so, for example, in China, we've just seen a law passed which requires Chinese citizens to join a dating app in order to facilitate
That's right.
more introductions and relationships and more children. In France, we just saw President Macron, push through without a lot of support, increasing the retirement age because they're trying to get
That's
more
right.
out of the labor force that they have. And what's unique about the United States is that we are a largely immigrant country. We do attract a large number of immigrants and refugees to our shores. And we do have the ability to help these individuals integrate in our communities and in our workforce. But in order to do that, we need to do two things. First, we need the political will. And second of all, we need to start seeing immigrants and refugees as a win for our communities, a win for our ability to innovate, a win for our economy. And by doing that, not asking ourselves the question, who should we let in? But asking ourselves the question, how well do we help these people integrate so that we can create shared
Mm-hmm.
prosperity for all of us?
Exactly right. And that's why I love what you do. Obviously, we need to talk about how the entire international community has to do more to help Afghans, especially Afghan women and children, get humanitarian visas. The morality is right there. We can talk about it all day. What I love about your organization is you talk about how economically smart it is. I'm very fond of pointing out that when adults or migrants arrive in the U.S., they're here ready to work. They're educated. They may have already had careers and they may already be skilled, but we don't have to pay for their education. They are showing up ready to enter our workforce and start paying into our Social Security plan. So getting them into the workplace is smart for all of us and, dare I say, really good for capitalism.
Well, and this, what's interesting about this moment is that today, 85% of the growth in our working age population is coming from immigrants and the children of immigrants. So the reality is for the United States of America today, immigrants are the future of our workforce. So the second piece, which is really interesting, which is what you touched on, is 50% of immigrants coming into the country today have a bachelor's degree or higher. So we're getting really a mixed flow of people. And I want to stress the United States needs all skill levels. You know, right now we have huge shortages in transportation, whether it's truck drivers, whether it's warehouse personnel, whether it's technicians. We have huge shortages in
Mm-hmm.
healthcare. And under COVID, you started to hear language around labor shortages in the healthcare sector are a national security risk because we are not able to take care of our people. And that becomes a huge risk for the
Yes.
country. And we seem to have forgotten that, even though we all know we have huge shortages in doctors and nurses. And actually, there are 165,000 internationally trained doctors in the United States today who are not working as physicians.
Yes.
They are working as, we have a doctor who's working at Wendy's as a cashier. We have a doctor
That's
who
it.
is a security guard. We have doctors who have not only been, as you said, trained internationally. We didn't have to invest in their education. We didn't have to invest in their work experience. Another country already did that. And yet they're here and they're unable to work and to really get back into their careers. And so that's a miss for us as a country. And I think it's not us leveraging the win-win with people who actually see the United States not as a transit country, but a destination country in which these are people who are rejoining family. These are people who are seeking refuge and
Yes.
safety. These are people who might have won the lottery because they really want to make the United States their home. And so they are looking to put roots, they are looking to invest. And and I
Yes.
say, you know, this is a mixed flow, we need all skill levels. And yet we see that more and more of immigrants are coming, refugees are coming from middle income countries. So for Afghans, we
Yes.
evacuated 75,000 plus Afghans. About a third of them speak English language proficiently and are professionals because they work just alongside our men and women um, as helicopter, it was, as Black Hawk helicopter pilots, as technicians on the bases, as interpreters. And out of the 250,000 Ukrainians that we've allowed into the country, 85% of them have an advanced education and professional experience. So the message
It's
here
amazing.
from Upwardly Global is that these individuals should not be sitting on the sidelines. They should not be underemployed. They should absolutely have the ability to re-enter their careers. And when we do that, we have tremendous impact. So if we just take the Afghan population that we've evacuated as an example, they have the
Okay.
potential to be contributing $1.7 billion to our economy a year. If we got them jobs at their skill level, they would be contributing
That's it.
227 million in taxes. This makes economic sense and it's morally correct. It's us fulfilling our promise.
Absolutely. According to Migration Policy Institute, I know you shared this, there's thousands of internationally trained immigrants and refugees in New York City right now, thousands, and many of them can't get a job because there's no recognition of their credentials from another country. Now, Upwardly Global, I know, just released a new report that goes deep into the positive impact Afghan professionals have already made on America's economy. It seems like, in a way, as they're dreading possibly being deported, no one's doing anything. But there is the Afghan Adjustment Act, which we're not hearing about too much in mainstream media. Can you tell us a bit about it?
So this is tragic because we are 2 years after the evacuation and the fall of Kabul, and this still has not been passed. The Afghan Adjustment Act would allow, so many Afghans came in on something we call humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole is a
Right.
temporary visa status, usually enacted for a year to 2 years, and it allows people with work authorization, but it doesn't necessarily allow them with any other benefits, the ability to access other services from the government. Now, once those
Mm-hmm.
2 years are up, they need to leave or they need to apply for asylum. And the challenge with asylum is, first of all, many of these Afghans, because they and their families were at risk because of the work they did for the US government, they burned all of their documents to demonstrate any connection with the US, with their
Mm.
education, which would indicate that they likely worked with the US government. And so they don't necessarily
Ah,
have
of course.
documents that would be required to
Right.
apply for asylum. So you've got these individuals who are stuck in limbo, who can't necessarily access asylum, or if they do, it is a very long, difficult path, which would really require a good lawyer. Or they're at risk of being told that they're not legally here, which means they would lose work authorization, and at some point the government would have the ability to deport them. Um, the Afghan Adjustment Act is important is because it would allow us to basically say all Afghans who were evacuated are eligible for skipping all of that process and being able to get a green card within a year. And a green card really puts you on a
Mm.
pathway for legal permanent residency, and on the pathway to US citizenship. And so instead of going through all of that headache, it would just eliminate all of it and allow them to be able to get the green card. So the other thing that people need to realize is this is not a unique case. We have done this in the US several times. We did this with the rise of Fidel Castro for the Cubans. We did this when
That's right.
the US withdrew from Vietnam. We did this following the US military actions in Iraq, both Operation Desert
That's
Storm
right.
and Operation Iraq Freedom. So we have clear precedent for this. The challenge is this needs to happen through Congress. And so
Yeah.
while you recently saw that Ukrainians were able to extend their humanitarian parole from 1 to 2 years, Afghans can't get that same benefit at this point because the administration doesn't have the power and authority to make that change. They need Congress to act.
Right. And as you pointed out, so many of these people don't have their papers because they had to destroy their papers because they helped us in the first place. I'd like to ask you, we are now, of course, marking the 1 year anniversary of the Ukraine war and the 1 year anniversary of the beginning of the Ukraine refugee crisis. In your experience, how are Ukraine refugees doing settling into new lives in the U.S. and how is that particular crisis going?
So the Ukraine crisis, it's always interesting when you have a beginning of a crisis. I've worked in many conflict zones and refugee response efforts internationally. And on average, a refugee is a refugee for 9 years. So realistically, when you see a crisis, you expect it to last at least 10 years. And yet, in the
Mm-hmm.
early days of Ukraine response, there was a hope that would be just the summer and people would return. And now we know that's not the case.
Yes.
Many Ukrainians who have been able to come, 215,000, as I mentioned before, many of them are professionals. They are settling in well. We have a large Ukrainian communities in the United States who have been very welcoming. We have a sponsorship program of individuals who are hosting Ukrainian refugees who have been incredibly welcoming. And many Ukrainians are settling in states where there are large existing Ukrainian communities, such as New York, California, Illinois. I would say they, of course, still face challenges in terms of being able to access the labor market because they
Yes.
their credentials might not be recognized. They might not know how to compete for a U.S. style interview. They probably have not written
Sure.
a resume in 10 years and have no idea what that actually looks like in the US. Not to mention, how do you ensure you put the right words in there for the technology ATS systems to pick it up? Um, and so I would say they are eager to work. Many of them are getting work authorization quickly and are working, and many of them are now looking to actually stay and raise their families. We had a wonderful woman, Anastasia,
Wow.
who has two master's degrees, came over with her 8-year-old son. Her husband is fighting, and she has now gotten a job as an IT recruiter and is just thrilled. She's living on Long Island, and now she says she really wants to stay. So I think the welcome has been great in the United States. I think the challenge is we haven't seen that level of engagement with Afghans, and that
Yeah.
is concerning.
Yeah.
And I would say in Europe, um, the welcome for Ukrainians has also been strong, particularly in Poland, because there's a large affinity between the two cultures and the two communities. And there's also a
Sure. Of
strong
course.
dislike between the two communities of Russia. They share that
Yes.
distrust. Um, and they have not accepted Afghans in the same way as they have the Ukrainian community. So I think for us, our message is the way we have welcomed Ukrainians should be the new standard, and that should be the standard for all communities. And now that we know what that looks like, we can hold ourselves to that bar.
I mean, you express yourself so beautifully with such great sensitivity. I just want to say, it really sounds like non-white refugees have a substantially more painful time in Western states. That's what we're talking about, right?
100%, 100%.
Yeah.
Bias and discrimination, assumptions that, we have wonderful Nigerian colleagues who've worked in the financial industry, and people assume that they don't speak English, even though English is the native language of Nigeria. And so there is an incredible amount of bias that sits at various intersections for our community. Um, and we see that both in terms of the type of jobs they get, how quickly they get into those jobs, and their starting salary, which
Mm,
is not a surprise given the gender wage gap and the fact that white women earn 84 cents to a white man's dollar and Black women earn 65 cents to a white man's dollar.
of
So
course.
a lot of work to be done on all fronts. And I guess I would say once we lift up one community, we lift up them all.
Well, let me ask you then about another bill that's making its way through Congress, and that's the New Deal for New Americans Act. I know this is something that Ed Markey has gotten behind. What is this? I've heard you say this is the most important comprehensive immigration inclusion bill. What would it entail, and how would it change the playing field for potential new Americans?
So I think one of the most important things for people to know is um, there is not a one single place where immigrants are considered in the administration, right? So there's not a spot for them to be considered as a community to understand how do we ensure their healthcare outcomes? How do we ensure their workforce outcomes? And yet they're a growing part of our population. As I mentioned before, they are the growth and the future of our
Yes.
workforce. And so
Hmm.
the New Deal for New Americans would not only shift how we process individuals and eligibility, as well as how we convert some folks like DACA. But
Right.
it would also impact the investments that we're making for immigrant inclusion at the federal level and at the state level. And so many states have already taken this on their own. They've set up Office of New Americans, which sit within their state government, which are tasked and responsible for ensuring that immigrants and refugees are considered across the administration's efforts at the state level. What we really need is for that to be best practice across the country.
It might seem kind of trivial, but I want to ask what you felt last week when we saw Ke Huy Quan win his Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for Everything Everywhere All at Once, and just announced that he began his career as a child in a refugee camp, and then went from that to, as he said, I ended up on Hollywood's biggest stage. I know that must have meant a lot to you and your colleagues.
It's so powerful to hear these stories, especially for our community, because one of the biggest challenges is a loss of belief that there will ever be a better future for them. I remember meeting a Turkish asylee who was a data analyst working in San Francisco, and he was cleaning toilets. And he would call his mom, and he was so ashamed of what he had gotten as a job that he lied to her about what he was doing for work. And now he's working and still working at Facebook. And that has been transformative because there's a loss of identity, there's a loss of belief that there is a future here. Many
Yes.
immigrants in our communities will tell us, the best you're going to be able to do is work at a nail salon, just give up on the fact that you had another identity in life.
Yeah.
Um, and so to see stories like that of perseverance is so powerful. Representation matters in so many ways, and it lifts so many people's dreams about what is actually possible.
I do want to point out that Department of Homeland Security just announced, I think 2 weeks ago, that Ukrainian refugees who came to the U.S. between late February and late April of last year now qualify for a humanitarian parole extension. That sounds very benevolent. Is it? Or is it just hitting a snooze alarm before more dread?
It is benevolent. The administration is keenly aware that they have used humanitarian parole extensively in terms of being able to get people in quickly. So it takes, on average, 3 to 5 years to apply and get refugee status into the United States. That means you're sitting in a camp somewhere and you've applied and you're the lucky 1% that gets to come to the United States. And it's taken you 3 to 5 years to secure that. And now you're here. It is the hardest way to legally come into the United States.
Mm.
Humanitarian parole has been used by this administration to basically accelerate that and say, we know Ukrainians are at risk. We're going to vet you for security, but you should just come on in. Um, Challenge with that is humanitarian parole is only good for up to 2 years. And so they're going to have a big mess on their hands after this
Yeah.
year. So they've bought time for themselves, yes. But it is because they believe Ukrainians should stay and they're not safe returning. But there's no pathway for future at this time unless they did a Ukrainian Adjustment Act, which they
Uh huh.
could. There's no future for somebody on humanitarian parole long term. Um, and I guess we'll have to see if the Afghan Adjustment Act comes out before the Ukrainian one.
It's just amazing that at a time when we see the proof that refugees and adult immigrants coming to the U.S. has helped replenish the U.S. labor force and our economy literally needs them, while at the same time, modern Confederates are trying to demonize immigrants and refugees when economically we need them more than ever. And that's why your work means so much. What's the best way, Ms. Krause-Vilmar, for our guests to follow Upwardly Global in your work and keep up with all your doings?
So I'm going to say go to my website because you'll find any link to LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter that you want from there, which is upwardlyglobal, one word, .org. And just on that last note, John, I heard
Please.
you say, immigrants are stealing our jobs in a previous segment with a
Well, I
caller.
said
And
it. I said it ironically. I hope you took it that
you
way.
said it ironically, but I wrote it down because I was like, actually, we're taking the jobs that nobody's doing and that we have
Exactly.
need done. And if you don't bring immigrants in, our economy is going to suffer and inflation is going to increase, and
That's it.
we're going to be in more of a mess than we already are in. So
I mean,
we're
two-thirds
you
of
could
Donald
argue
Trump's
we're the
wives.
solution to all the problems.
Two-thirds of Donald Trump's wives were immigrants doing work that Americans born here didn't want to do. And you're right. For all of these
100%.
anti-refugee, anti-immigrant politicians, who do you think is going to be taking care of you in 30 years when you're 90 years old? It is such a pleasure and an honor to have you. Jina Krause-Vilmar is president and CEO of Upwardly Global. Please, please come back anytime. I'd love to have you back and talk more about your work and about how this struggle for decency and economic sustenance is going.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've got to take a quick break. When we return, your calls all the way till midnight on the East Coast, 9 p.m. on the Pacific at 866-997-4748, 866-997-GRIT. We'll be right back.